This building and the space that we're in was constructed in 1916, and it was paid for by a woman named Emily Bourne, who was the daughter of Jonathan Bourne. And Jonathan Bourne's bust is over the door there. Jonathan Bourne was one of the most successful whaling merchants, agents in the history of New Bedford. There were half a dozen, and he was one of them. And he made a vast fortune, mostly right whaling until the time of the Civil War. And then after the Civil War, he focused on sperm whales. And after the Civil War, the country needed everything. And sperm oil was up to over $2 a gallon. And so Jonathan Bourne, unlike the other whaling merchants in the city, didn't divest himself of his investments. He built new ships. He built new whalers. He increased the size of his fleet, which was pretty extraordinary because right before the Civil War, the whale fishery was past its peak, and a lot of agents were selling off their vessels or not buying new ones, not investing in the fishery, letting it sort of peter out. And Jonathan Bourne did just the opposite. He doubled down, he built new ships, and he managed to be very, very successful right up into the 1880s. And along the way, he was investing in many other opportunities in the city. But this building was specifically devoted to whaling, Yankee whaling. Outside, when you look at the building, outside it says, Bourne Whaling Museum, carved in stone over the door. This is the center, really of American whaling interpretation. And at the center of the center is this half-scale model of the bark Lagoda, which was said to have been Bourne's favorite vessel. He made more money with this vessel than any other vessel in his fleet. And I know that because I doubt everything, and every time somebody says some absolute thing like that, I have to run to my office and do a week of research to figure out whether it's true or not. And it was very close between the bark Hunter and the bark Lagoda, but in the end, it was the Lagoda that made more money. So a couple of fascinating things about the Lagoda is that in 1916, there were no ship carpenters in New Bedford who had ever built a whaler before. The last whaler built in New Bedford was the bark Bertha, and she was built in 1877, I think. So it was a long time, years and years before. What there were riggers and sailmakers and plenty of carpenters. They just had never actually built a ship from the keel up. And so the Lagoda herself she wasn't wrecked in Japan. She sprang a ghastly leak and was condemned in Japan in 1880. It'll say on here, I forget the date. It's like 1882 or 1881 or something like that. And she was turned into a coal hulk. But the ship itself was built in Scituate as a standard American merchant ship. The Lagoda herself was built in Scituate as a merchantman, and she was in the hide trade. You can read Richard Henry Dana's 2 years before the mast, talking about his time on the coast of California, and they saw the Lagoda, and he writes about it, in the book. And this is long before she became a whaler. Jonathan Bourne bought the vessel in 1841 as a right whaler, and added her to the fleet. But she was wrecked in the 1880s, so how did anybody know what the Lagoda actually looked like? Well, they didn't know. they had the dimensions from the ship's registers, but they also had the Charles W. Morgan, which was built in New Bedford in 1841, and the Lagoda and the Morgan kind of look alike, and they were built at the same sort of time and the same kind of way, and so the Lagoda, while the dimensions are right for the Lagoda herself, much of the outfit was actually based on the Charles W. Morgan and the memories of the people who sailed on the ship. So there were still people around who sailed on the Lagoda. And so it's an extraordinary model. It has all the bells and whistles that you would want in a Yankee whaler in the late period. It's got masthead hoops up there, way up at the top, where the guys would stand up there in their hoops and they'd look out for whales. And it's got a suspended cutting stage that hangs off the side of the vessel, and it's got a canopy over the try works, and it's got an after cabin back here, and it's got 5 boats. Wow! It has all this stuff that would be typical of a whaler in the post-1850s era, when American whalers began penetrating the Western Arctic in the early 1850s. The ships needed to have some adaptations, namely these hurricane houses on the back for protection from the weather, and the canopy over the try works to keep the rain and snow, blowing snow, from getting into the try pots when they're cooking whales, when they're cooking blubber. And so, a lot of the stuff that you see, and this is very important for me in my job because if I'm looking at a piece of scrimshaw, or if I'm looking at a painting or a logbook or a journal or some kind of an image or something like that, I can date it by how the vessel looks, because certain things didn't come in until later. And, a whaler from the 1820s wouldn't look any different from any other vessel, except that it had whale boats, and if it was burning a whale, smoke, coming from the try works. Other than that, from a distance, you couldn't tell a whaler from any other vessel. Whereas later on, it's got everything, and this vessel's got it all. So it's a square-rigged bark. So a bark has 3 masts: the foremast, the mainmast, and the mizzen mast. All 3 of those masts have yards that cross them. So if you look up here, you see that those yards go across the mast, right? That's called a square rigger. They're square rigged. They have square sails. This mizzen mast has a boom that sticks out parallel to the hull, right? And the sail is going the other way. That's called a fore and aft sail. And so a bark is square rigged on the fore, square rigged on the main, and fore and aft rigged on the mizzen. A ship is square rigged on the fore, square rigged on the main, and square rigged on the mizzen. Full rigged ships were things of beauty, absolutely gorgeous things. But the thing of it was, and this circles back to the big E, economics, it took more skilled sailors to man a full rigged ship than it did to man a bark, which matters in the whale fishery because skilled sailors are expensive. You need a few skilled sailors, but what you really need are whalemen. What you really need are these guys who know how to kill whales and aren't afraid and are strong, and that's the thing. When you go to sign your shipping paper over here, when you sign on a whaler, the first thing they do is, you look pretty strong. Do you drink?
Yeah.
How much do you drink?
Enough.
So you're not a drunk, are you? No. You ever had tuberculosis? No? Consumption?
I don't know what that is.
Well, you look pretty healthy to me, Have you ever been on a ship before? So you're a green hand. So you get the lowest wage. How about you? Have you been on a ship before? Yeah? What ship were you on?
On the Renshaw
The Renshaw
at Pearl Harbor.
and Pearl Harbor. So you're an able seaman? Say yes.
Yes.
Yes. He's an able seaman. He's a green hand. Okay? So this guy's going to get more pay than he is. Where are you from?
Stoughton.
From where? Stoughton. He's from Stoughton. Where are you from? See, he's a local guy. He's a local guy. And this guy here, this green hand, he's going whaling. Who knows why you want to go whaling? Maybe you owe money. Maybe you just want to go out and see the world. These are perfectly legitimate reasons to go whaling. Fleeing the law, fleeing, some romantic entanglement. The idea that you just want to do something and you can. And you can sign on board a whaler and go do whatever you want to until you find out once you get out there that's really not something that you really wanted to do. But this fellow over here is from Marion, and he's already been on a couple of voyages, and he's going to make more money than you are because he has the experience. And Jonathan Bourne, this is a little bit of a kind of an exhibition about what his office probably looked like, but that is the view from his office window. So that's the view of Merrill's Wharf from Jonathan Bourne's office window. So as he sat at his desk, and this is his desk, that was in his office, and he looked out his window, that's what he saw. He and a couple of other agents, including John Avery Parker, but Bourne in particular, interviewed his officers before they went on a voyage. He had references, and he ran those references down. So just because you give him a letter and say that you sailed, on Coffin's ship Japan on her last voyage, as an able seaman, he would write to Coffin and say, what do you know about this guy? And Coffin would write back and say that he's a good man. And then he would, and that's generally all it was, he was a good man. Smart feller, these kinds of things. And you see it in the communication, and that's what Bourne did. Because, again, he's got $2 million invested in this vessel. They don't want drunkards. They don't want troublemakers on board. When you're talking 35 guys on shipboard or 30 guys on shipboard in a fleet that numbers 300 vessels, you're going to get some duds, and it happened. There was all kinds of adventures and mutinies and you name it, it happened. Because, again, do the math, 15,000 voyages, figure 25 guys per voyage. What's 25 times 15,000? That's how many human experiences we're talking about over a period of years. So, these two guys, they live in a bunk, right? So that's his bunk, and that's the other guy's bunk. And that's where you live in a room for 3 years. So this exhibition here is really kind of cool. Because it has all the elements of cutting in and trying out on shipboard. So these are the objects themselves, and you have, starting over here on my right, you have the grinding wheel and a spade, and then a spade sheath here. These spades were made of steel, and they were kept razor sharp, because blubber is strange stuff. Anatomically, biologically, it's weird. It's not like pig fat. It's not soft like pig fat. It has not tendons, but tendon-like material that builds the blubber and holds it all together. So that, for instance, when it's time to cut in a whale, you cut a hole in the blubber and you put a big iron hook in the hole, and you've got 20 guys heaving at the windlass on shipboard, hauling this 2-inch line and a heavy chain attached to a blubber hook, hooked into that blubber, and it just peels the blubber off the whale. And the blubber doesn't break. It is incredibly tough stuff. And it has to be. I mean, these animals they're mammals that live in the sea, and sperm whales dive, a mile, 2 miles deep into the ocean. Their anatomy has to be adapted for that, and blubber is weird stuff. Very few other animals have blubber. These tools would get very dull as they're chopping into that tough blubber, and it was one guy's job to crank the grindstone, and he was generally the dimmest guy on board. So if there was a guy who just plain wasn't particularly bright, or was maybe a troublemaker, or his job was to turn the grindstone. There were master craftsmen on board, carpenters and coopers generally, sometimes a blacksmith. And their job was to make sure that those tools were kept razor sharp, because you need a dozen spades to cut in a whale, and they all had to be sharp. And so we have a variety of different kinds of spades here. And this is the fun part of working in a museum. Why is that handle so long? So that cutting stage that's hanging off the side of the vessel there, right? Here's photographs of it. So these photos, 1, 2, 3. Here, come on up. Check them out. You see these guys standing on the cutting stage with those long spades? You see how far it is from where they're standing to where the whale is? Yeah, so it's a long way. So that's why they're so long. You got to be able to reach the whale. Now, some of them have little short handles. And these ones with the little short handles, they were used in the boats, in the whale boats. There's any number of reasons why you need to have a sharp spade in a whale boat. Sometimes after the whale is dead, you need to cut holes either in the head or in the flukes in order to tow the whale back to the ship, and you use a spade to cut hole in the flukes or in the head. Sometimes there was a technique that was particularly used in right whaling called pitchpoling. And what pitchpoling was if you were fast to a fighting whale that was giving you a real hard time, the idea was to slice the tendons that attach the flukes to the spine. So it would be essentially like cutting your Achilles heel. And the way to do that was to get as close as possible, very, very dangerous, with a broad-headed spade, sort of like that one. But any of these spades would do the job, and cut through the small. So the small is that part of the anatomy where the flukes meet the torso. And it's all those tendons come together in one spot. And if you can cut those, then the whale's sort of dead in the water. He's not going to be able to fight back. So there's a lot of different reasons for all these tools. These are called this is a boarding knife. And a boarding knife was used to slice through a blanket piece of blubber. So once that blubber was, once the blubber hook is into the blubber, and the blubber is, the spades have cut down into the carcass of the whale, and they're dragging that piece of blubber up. It'll go as high as it can go, and then you got to cut that blanket piece off and lower it down below decks so that it can be chopped up into smaller pieces. So, and what's the nature of blubber? It's oily, isn't it? It's oily, slippery. And you got a guy over here that's doing nothing but keeping his tools razor sharp. And this is a boarding knife, right? So what do you think that ball is for right there? Who said it? What did you say? Yeah. It's real simple, but nonetheless, it's incredibly evocative to imagine. You don't want your hand sliding down onto that razor-sharp blade, because you just cut your fingers right off. And so, every one of these boarding knives has some sort of a ball right there to keep the hand, as you're doing that work. And keep in mind, you're not working on the floor, you're working on shipboard. Everything's moving. You got this giant slab of blubber attached to, big iron, big steel chains and iron hooks, and you got sharp implements all over the place. It's a hard job, dangerous job, and it demands the kind of skill that this fellow's going to have at the end of his voyage. He's going to be able to come back and sail on another voyage because we didn't pay him anything in the first place. So he's going to owe money when he gets back, and you'll have Tahiti's looking pretty good, isn't it? But you got to get back somehow. All right. So all this stuff, mincing knives, boarding knives, spades, they're all made of steel, super high grade steel. The harpoons were made of iron. You only have to use a harpoon once. A harpoon doesn't need to be kept sharp other than one time. And then of course these big blubber hooks and whatnot are also made out of iron, and as are the pots. So the pots are also made out of iron. So this entire operation that we're talking about, from everything that I've started talking about over here to right here, is just about getting the oil. The next question is, so what? These two guys in the photographs are using a mincing knife, and this is a mincing knife, and there's two more, and you can see that the top one has been sharpened so many times that there's nothing left of the blade. And this one is it's about the depth of the blade, and once the blanket piece of blubber had been hauled up and lowered to the blubber room below decks on the Lagoda, the guys down there would chop it up into what are called horse pieces. That's what they called them horse pieces, and it was a piece of blubber about that big, and then you fork it up and throw it into the bucket here. And in the meantime, the mates have fired up the try-works, so they've got two iron pots and a brick furnace, and he built a fire in the furnace, and it heats up the pots. And you've got guys here that are taking the blubber out of the tub, or taking the blubber as it's passed to them, and they take a mincing knife, and you can see in the photograph that one man's holding the blubber and the other one is slicing into that chunk of blubber. And that's simply to give more surface area to release the oil. So mincing a horse piece is to allow that blubber to release the oil easily when it goes into the pots. And so it would go thrown into the pots and boiled down until it was a pure oil, and you just keep pitching more and more blubber into the pots, and it would boil and boil and boil, and after a while you'd have to remove that blubber, and in order to remove it you use this strainer, and you get a sense really of the objects can tell you so much. I mean, look how long this tool is. And then you look at the photograph and you see how far back the guy's standing, and you see that he's wearing like this canvas coat and trousers, and that's boiling oil. If that stuff would splash on you, it would burn you. And so you may see, and you will see, some pretty romantic paintings of this, these shirtless, robust guys working at the try-pots, and it's like, well, I guess. I mean, I wouldn't do it. I'd wear a coat because boiling oil could land on you and it would burn you. And so here these guys are, and you can see this fellow in the top view. He's ladling out those what they're called fritters. So where those horse pieces have been minced into, it's all the language. There's an explanation right up here. Bible leaves. Mince those horse pieces thin into Bible leaves. And then you pitch them into the pots, and then all the oil's boiled out, and you've got this desiccated thing, and you strain it out of the oil, and you just throw it right in the fire. Just throw it right in the fire, and it burns really hot, and then you keep your fire going. You get the fire going with wood first, and then these fritters next. Yeah. So the whole furnace is sitting on a platform on the deck of the ship. What's the inherent danger here? Yeah, fires, right? And so there's a big box that's under the try-works, and it's lined with lead, and it's filled with water. And you have to keep periodically filling that box up with water to keep the heat from the try-works from burning through the deck of the ship. And so it's pretty dangerous stuff. And on top of that, and this is the really important part, you got to do a good job of boiling out that oil. It's not just like, you don't just pitch it into the pots and turn around, and go get a bagel. I mean, you've got to manage the process, because if flesh or blood or like some kind of offal from, the carcass or dirt gets into the pots, into the oil, it's going to taint the oil. And it'll lessen its value. And so, in the owner's instructions to the master, he'll say very clearly, make clean oil, meaning that this process has to be very, very carefully managed. And it was managed by the officers. So remember when we were talking back up there and I was talking about sailors and whalemen? The difference between a good sailor and a good whaleman? You could be a great sailor, but you had to have the skills in the whale fishery to become an officer and a master. You had to know all about all of this stuff in order to become in order to follow a career as a whaleman, and to keep your job, which gets us to the next level. So what happens is that hot oil gets bailed out of the try-pots and into a copper box. And you'll see the copper. We don't have a copper box in the collection. It's called it's a cooling box. It's made out of copper, and there's one on the deck of the Lagoda, and about a third of the way up in the box there's a spigot. And so what would happen was you fill that copper box up with water almost to the spigot, and then you ladle that hot oil out of the pots and into the cooler, right into the water. And what happens with oil and water? Right, the oil will float to the surface. And then, but the water and the copper will help cool that oil because it's going out of the boiling hot pots and it's going into wooden casks. So these casks over here, these are very small ones, and then there's a 100-gallon cask back there in the corner. These were made on shore by coopers. So the cooper built white oak casks for the whale fishery. And then comes the gauging process. And this is a really interesting part of whaling history. So all of these casks, and before the vessel ever even set sail, you'd have a cask stowage diagram. Now, let me ask you this. Why do you reckon that each of these only shows half the vessel?
It's the same on either side.
Right. That's pretty straightforward. You just double it up, right? But they have numbers on here. So this big cask says 4650. So this is designed for a cask that's between 46 and 50 inches across the head, right? And then, so there, before that vessel ever sets sail, the owner is figuring, if it's a sperm whaling voyage and it's going to be gone for 4 years, they're going to return X amount of oil at the current rate, which is, say, $1.35 a gallon. I figure the way the market's been going, it could be $1.38 a couple of years from now. The market's looking pretty good. So I will send them sperm whaling to the Indian Ocean to be back in 4 years' time. And while he's doing that, he's hedging his bets. And this is Jonathan Bourne and John Avery Parker and these guys. They got another vessel, and they're going to do the same thing, except they're sending them on a 2-year right whaling voyage to the coast of Patagonia, right, to Argentina, to the coast of Argentina, to be back in 2 years' time. So what he's figuring is, I know my master, I know my officers, all my officers were good right whalemen, so they're going to be out for 2 years on Argentina, on Patagonia, or off Brazil, and they're going to be back with maybe 1,800 to 2,000 barrels of whale oil, which is currently selling at 40 cents a gallon. When they get back, I hope maybe it's 41 and a half cents a gallon. So I'm figuring that those guys are going to be back in 2 years. My 4-year voyage is going to be back 2 years after with sperm oil that I figure is going to be worth a little bit more. So he's planning ahead. He's planning ahead. And that's what this cask stowage diagram is all about. He's got these highly skilled coopers that work on his wharf, working in his sort of aura, and they build these casks, and they put them on the ship. Some of them are filled with fresh water for the consumption of the crew. Some of them are filled with salt water to act as sort of ballast. Most of them are set up and then taken apart, and the casks have numbers on the staves, Roman numerals, so that those casks are set up, brand new. So say that it's a brand new white oak cask, or they've got a pile of casks that were used for sperm oil on the last voyage, and they just set them up and then take them down and put them all together in a bundle called a shook. And that shook would then be stored in the bow of the ship under the forecastle. All down in there would be full of shooks. And as, say it's a really successful voyage to the Indian Ocean, and these guys are killing 40-barrel, 50, 60, 80-barrel sperm whales, they're going through their casks pretty quick. So they've got their cooper, and the cooper has to go down into the shooks and pull out the shooks, set them up on the deck, build that cask, rebuild the cask, and then take it over to next to the cooler, next to the try-works, where you've got a hose. Remember that spigot that I was talking about in the cooler? You attach the hose to the spigot, and you put all that oil in the cooler, and you turn on the spigot, and the spigot runs the hose into the cask and fills up the cask, and then the cooper makes sure that it's good and tight so it's not going to leak. They leave it on deck for a little while to make sure it's good and cool, and they do that until the whale is boiled out. And if it makes 40 barrels, it makes 40 barrels. If it makes 80, it makes 80, yep. So at the end of the voyage, you break out the casks onto the wharf, and then you got a gauger. And there's a gauger that works for Uncle Sam. There's a professional gauger that works for the counting house. But most of the agents had their own gauger, the guy that worked for them. And the counting house gauger, he had a different job. But the gauger who worked for the agent would go down to the wharf, and he had his tools. And he's got these bung starters here, and he's got these big cask calipers, and he's got his scraper. The scraper's on the right. And the thing is that the head of these casks, you can reach down here and feel, this is, look, there's still oil coming out of that cask. That thing's been there since 1904, and there's still oil coming out of it. And there's information on the head of those casks, and that information is carved with those tools on the far side of the case, those funny-looking tools with the handle and the spikes that stick down. Those tools are designed to carve straight lines and circles, so Roman numerals, or if you need to make a circle, you need to make a circle. And so you carve information on the head of the cask, and it'll say W for whale, or H for head matter, or B for body, body indicating sperm whale body blubber. And but these things are filthy when they come out of the hold, and so you got to take your scraper and you got to scrape the head of the cask to see what the information is, and then you got to pop the bung out of the cask. And a bung is a cone-shaped piece of wood that's pounded into a cone-shaped hole. And that hole is made with a tool called a bung auger. And it's a cone-shaped, looks like a giant drill bit. They're about that big, and they go very wide at the top, and then they come down to a narrow, and they've got a cross T-handle, and you just and cut a hole into the bung stave. And when you drive a bung into that hole, they don't come out. They won't come out. Once you drive it in, it's not going to come out, and the only way to get it out is to vibrate it out. And so in order to do that, you use a bung starter, and that's why I put all these bung starters up, because they're really cool. And once you know what they are, you can see that there's all different kinds. Look, the third one in there from the left, it has a whale jaw bone head, and they're all. See how flexible they are. See how they narrow. The idea is to create a vibration. And if you look at this cask, you'll see on either side of the bung, and you really see it on that little cask, it's all the wood's worn away. I mean, these things were used and reused and reused, and they just got banged so many times. So once that bung vibrates out of the hole, now you have access to the inside of the cask. And that's where these gauging rods come in. So you look at these gauging rods that are in the case here. There's one hanging here and two more down here. See how they come to a wedge point? This will give you a little bit of an idea of how hardcore these guys are as capitalists. There's a groove. This white pine head fits in the groove in this oak cask. That tool goes through the bung hole and into that groove. So they're not missing anything that's in the cask. They will be able to figure out what the contents are quantity-wise, and then you can dip your test tubes in or use a pump like that one to extract the oil and put it into a container where it can be examined later, and look for the color and the smell. And what you want is a sweet and handsome oil, not brown and stinking oil. And these are important terms. So if the gauger says that a cask brown and stinking, and they'll actually say that, 52 casks sweet and handsome, 1 cask brown and stinking, it just indicates the quality of the oil itself. And this little notebook here, you take a look at that notebook. Everything in this exhibit is here for a reason. No two of those numbers are the same. Why do you reckon that is?
Different barrels.
Yeah, different contents from different sized casks. Okay, so I guess we're done. Are we done?
Of this part, yes.
And then we.
We're actually going to be transitioning to Sandy Moss description.
Okay, all right. So we got to the end of gauging.